September 3, 1943, somewhere in the scorching flatlands outside Hearne, Texas, Klaus Zimmermann pressed his forehead against the rough wooden slats of the transport truck, trying to make sense of the impossible landscape rolling past his eyes. Endless fields stretched toward horizons that seemed to curve with the earth itself, cotton plants heavy with white bolls that glowed like snow under a sun more brutal than anything he had experienced in North Africa. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The abundance was obscene. Crops growing in quantities that could feed entire German cities, tended by machines he could hear rumbling in the distance, harvesting wealth from soil that seemed to produce miracles without effort. For 2 years, he had fought in Rommel's Afrika Korps, surviving on dried bread and whatever could be scavenged from supply lines that grew thinner with each passing month. When British forces had captured his unit outside Tunis 5 months earlier, he expected imprisonment in England, perhaps Canada, somewhere cold and harsh where German soldiers would be reminded daily of their defeat. Instead, after weeks on a transport ship, he found himself in the middle of Texas, being driven toward a prisoner of war camp in a landscape so impossibly fertile it seemed like propaganda designed to break German morale. The contradiction between everything Klaus had been told about American weakness and the reality unfolding through the gaps in the truck slats was about to shatter every assumption he had carried across 2 continents. What he didn't know was that he was being transported to a place where German prisoners would experience something far more devastating than captivity. They would encounter ordinary American prosperity, witness casual generosity from farmers and townspeople who should have been their enemies, and discover that everything the Reich had promised was built on foundations of lies so complete they amounted to an alternate reality constructed from desperation rather than truth. The truck hit a pothole, jolting Klaus against his fellow prisoners. 17 men packed into a space designed for cargo rather than humans, yet even this uncomfortable transport exceeded the conditions they had endured during the final months in North Africa. The American guards had provided water at regular intervals during the journey from the port. Real water, clean and cold, served in metal canteens that didn't leak. None of the prisoners had suffered beatings or abuse despite propaganda warnings that capture by Americans meant torture and execution. Werner Vogel, who had served as a mechanic in Klaus's unit, pressed his face against the opposite side of the truck, his eyes wide with disbelief. "The machines," he whispered, his voice hoarse from thirst despite the water they had received. "Did you see the machines in those fields? Tractors twice the size of anything we had in Germany, running on gasoline. These farmers apparently have an unlimited supply." Klaus had seen them. Massive John Deere and International harvester machines rolling across fields with mechanical efficiency that made German agricultural equipment seem like children's toys. Each tractor represented more steel, more fuel, more industrial capacity than entire German farming communities could access. Yet here they operated as routine tools, driven by individual farmers rather than collective operations managed by party officials. The truck slowed as it approached the entrance to Camp Hearne, passing through gates that seemed almost casual in their construction. No massive fortifications, no imposing guard towers designed to intimidate. Just functional fencing, modest watchtowers, and American soldiers who looked barely old enough to shave, carrying rifles with the relaxed posture of men who expected no trouble from their charges. As Klaus climbed down from the truck, his boots hit Texas soil that radiated heat like a furnace. The camp spread before him in organized rows of barracks that looked newly constructed, painted white against the glare, surrounded by grounds that had been cleared and leveled with obvious care. This wasn't a hasty internment facility thrown together to warehouse enemies. This was planned infrastructure, built with resources and labor that suggested America could afford to house German prisoners in conditions that exceeded how Germany housed its own soldiers. An American officer stepped forward, a captain in his early 30s whose uniform was clean, properly fitted, and showed none of the wear that had characterized German officers' clothing by 1943. He carried a clipboard and spoke in accented but competent German that surprised every prisoner within earshot. "Welcome to Camp Hearne," the captain announced, his tone professional but not hostile. "You will be housed in barracks that provide protection from weather. You will receive 3 meals daily prepared according to Geneva Convention standards. You will have access to medical care, recreational facilities, and opportunities for work details that provide compensation under international law. You will be treated as soldiers rather than criminals, provided you follow camp regulations and cause no trouble. The words sounded like fantasy. 3 meals daily when German civilians queued for hours to receive single rations of bread mixed with sawdust. Medical care when German hospitals had run short of basic supplies months ago. Recreational facilities when the concept of recreation had become meaningless in a nation fighting for survival. Klaus exchanged glances with Werner, seeing his own disbelief reflected in his friend's expression. This had to be temporary, some elaborate show designed to extract information before conditions reverted to the brutality they had been promised would come. No nation could afford such treatment of enemy prisoners while simultaneously fighting a global war on multiple fronts. The prisoners were led to their assigned barracks, wooden structures raised on concrete foundations to prevent flooding, with screened windows that allowed air circulation in the oppressive heat. Inside, Klaus found rows of metal cots with actual mattresses, thin but present, along with folded blankets and pillows that seemed like impossible luxury after months of sleeping on sand or bare ground. Each man received a locker for personal belongings, a metal container that locked with a key the Americans actually provided. The concept of prisoners having personal property worth securing seemed absurd, yet here stood proof that American authorities expected German soldiers to accumulate possessions during their internment. The first meal arrived at 6 in the evening, carried from a mess hall by prisoners who had been at the camp longer. Klaus accepted his metal tray with hands that trembled slightly, not from weakness but from anticipation mixed with dread about what disappointment might follow the elaborate setup. What he saw on that tray would haunt him for years, not because it was terrible, but because it was impossible. A portion of beef that exceeded what German soldiers had received even before rationing began. Mashed potatoes made with real dairy, not the ersatz substitutes that had become standard. Green beans that showed no signs of rot or preservation damage. White bread, actual white bread made from wheat flour that gleamed under the mess hall lights. And butter, real butter in a quantity that German civilians hadn't seen since 1940. Klaus stood frozen, staring at food that represented more calories, more nutrition, more agricultural production than his family in Stuttgart had consumed in a month. The other new arrivals showed similar paralysis, unable to comprehend that this abundance was intended for them, for enemy prisoners who deserved nothing but the minimum necessary for survival. An older prisoner, a sergeant named Hans Keller who had arrived 3 weeks earlier, noticed their hesitation and laughed without humor. "It's real," he said quietly in German. "They feed us like this every day. Sometimes better. Wait until you taste the Sunday meals." The words made no sense. Sunday meals implied variation, improvement beyond what already seemed impossible. Klaus forced himself to sit at one of the long tables and lift a fork to his mouth. The beef was tender, properly cooked, seasoned with salt and pepper that added flavor rather than masking spoilage. The potatoes were creamy and rich, mixed with butter and milk that spoke of dairy production on scales Germany couldn't match. The green beans were fresh enough to retain color and texture despite cooking. He ate slowly, methodically, trying to process the contradiction between this meal and everything he knew about wartime resource allocation. Around him, other prisoners consumed their food with similar confusion, their faces showing the cognitive dissonance of men whose understanding of reality was beginning to fracture. Werner sat across from Klaus, tears streaming down his face as he ate bread that reminded him of childhood before the war had consumed everything. The taste of real wheat, properly milled and baked, triggered memories of a Germany that no longer existed, a prosperity that had been sacrificed for promises of greater glory through conquest. After the meal, as evening settled over the camp and the temperature finally began to drop from its afternoon peak, prisoners gathered in small groups to discuss what they had experienced. Klaus joined a circle of men from his unit, all of them struggling to reconcile American abundance with the propaganda that had shaped their understanding of the world. "They're trying to break us," suggested Otto Klein, a corporal who had always been a committed party member. "Make us soft before the interrogations begin. This generosity is just preparation for psychological warfare." But Hans Keller, the veteran prisoner, shook his head. There are no interrogations, he explained patiently. They already extracted whatever military intelligence we possessed during initial processing. This isn't warfare. This is just how they operate. America has so much food, so much productive capacity, that feeding enemy prisoners well costs them nothing. The statement hung in the air like blasphemy. Everything Klaus had been taught insisted that America was on the verge of collapse, its diverse population unable to unite effectively, its democratic system too weak to sustain military production, its Jewish influences corrupting society from within. Yet here he sat in a camp that demonstrated industrial organization, agricultural abundance, and logistical competence that exceeded anything Germany had achieved even during peacetime. That night, lying on his cot with a full stomach for the first time in months, Klaus stared at the ceiling and tried to understand what was happening. The barracks were comfortable despite the heat, the mattress providing support his body had forgotten existed, the pillow allowing rest without the neck pain that had become constant during military service. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Through the screen windows, he could hear sounds of the Texas night. Crickets chirping in numbers that suggested thriving insect populations, which implied healthy ecosystems, which required abundant plant life, which demonstrated agricultural productivity that sustained entire food chains beyond what humans directly cultivated. Even the wildlife was better fed in Texas than German soldiers had been in North Africa. Sleep came reluctantly, interrupted by dreams where fields of cotton transformed into wheat fields in Germany, where tractors plowed soil that produced only dust, where his mother queued for bread that crumbled in her hands. He woke before dawn, disoriented by comfort, confused by the absence of danger, struggling to accept that captivity felt safer than serving the Reich had ever been. The morning routine began at 6, announced by a bell rather than shouted commands. Prisoners filed toward washrooms that featured running water, actual plumbing with multiple sinks and shower stalls. Klaus had expected buckets and communal basins, the minimum facilities required by international law. Instead he found infrastructure that rivaled what German barracks had provided before the war consumed resources for military production. The showers delivered hot water, heated by systems that functioned reliably rather than failing constantly like German equipment had done. Klaus stood under the spray longer than necessary, letting heat penetrate muscles that had learned to expect only cold water or none at all. Soap was provided, real soap that produced lather rather than the ersatz substitutes that had replaced actual cleaning products in Germany. Breakfast arrived at 7, another impossible meal that challenged every assumption about wartime scarcity. Scrambled eggs made from real eggs rather than powder, cooked with butter that added richness he had forgotten existed. Bacon, actual pork bacon fried until crisp, representing meat consumption that exceeded what German civilians received monthly. Toast made from white bread, served with jam that contained real fruit and sugar. Coffee, genuine coffee brewed from beans that produced aroma and flavor rather than the acorn-based substitutes that had become standard even for officers. Klaus consumed the meal while watching American guards who showed no interest in the prisoners beyond maintaining basic order. The soldiers were young, healthy, well-fed themselves, equipped with uniforms and gear that showed no signs of shortage or substitution. They represented a military that could afford to station troops at domestic installations rather than deploying every available man to combat zones. After breakfast, the camp commander assembled new arrivals for orientation. Major Patterson stood before them without translator, speaking German with the confidence of someone who had studied the language formally rather than learning it from necessity. His presence itself demonstrated American educational advantages that Nazi ideology claimed were impossible in democratic societies. "You are prisoners of war under protection of the Geneva Convention," Patterson explained, his accent marking him as someone from the northern states. "You will be treated according to international law. In exchange, we expect compliance with camp regulations and respect for American authority. Those who cooperate will find their time here passes comfortably. Those who cause trouble will face disciplinary measures, but nothing that violates treaty obligations." He paused, letting his words register before continuing. "Many of you will be assigned to work details in the surrounding area. Local farmers need labor for cotton harvest, and we have agreements that provide compensation for your work while ensuring you're treated properly. This is voluntary, but I recommend participation. The work is easier than military service, the pay allows you to purchase amenities from the camp store, and the time passes faster when you're productive. The concept of voluntary labor seemed contradictory to prisoner status. Klaus had expected forced work details, exhausting labor designed to extract value from captured enemies. Instead, Patterson described arrangements that sounded almost like civilian employment, with protections and compensation that exceeded what many German workers had received before the war. Over the following days, Klaus began to understand the scope of his delusion about American society. The camp operated with efficiency that demonstrated organizational competence Germany had claimed only militaristic societies could achieve. Supplies arrived on schedule, equipment functioned reliably, systems worked without constant crisis management that had characterized German military operations. The camp store carried goods that seemed impossible given global warfare. Cigarettes, candy, toiletries, writing materials, even musical instruments available for purchase using scrip earned through labor. The variety suggested supply chains that functioned across continents despite combat operations, logistics networks that could deliver consumer goods to prison camps while simultaneously supporting military forces on multiple fronts. Klaus volunteered for a work detail, partly from boredom but mostly from curiosity about the civilian population that supported this elaborate prisoner infrastructure. On his first morning, an American farmer named Samuel Morrison arrived at the camp in a truck that looked newer than any vehicle Klaus had seen in Germany for years. The Ford F-Series pickup gleamed with fresh paint, ran smoothly without the mechanical problems that had plagued German transport, and pulled a trailer large enough to carry 20 men comfortably. Morrison was in his late 50s, weathered by sun and labor but showing none of the malnutrition that had become visible in German civilians by 1943. He wore denim overalls over a cotton shirt, work boots that looked sturdy and well-maintained, and a hat that shaded his face from the Texas sun. His hands were calloused from labor but not damaged by injury or neglect. "Morning, boys," Morrison greeted them in English, then switched to broken German. "We pick cotton today. Hard work, but fair pay. I provide water, lunch, breaks when needed. You work honest, I treat you honest." The cotton fields stretched beyond visual range, planted in rows so straight they seemed to demonstrate geometric precision impossible without sophisticated surveying equipment. The plants stood healthy and full, each bowl heavy with fiber ready for harvest. Klaus had seen agricultural propaganda showing German farming achievements, but those staged photographs couldn't match the casual reality of Morrison's commercial operation. The work was difficult, bending repeatedly to pull cotton from bowls under sun that beat down like physical pressure. But Morrison provided exactly what he had promised. Water arrived regularly in barrels mounted on a truck driven by his teenage son, who showed no fear of German prisoners despite propaganda that should have taught him to hate enemies who had killed American soldiers. Lunch came at noon, sandwiches made with actual meat, cheese, vegetables, and bread that exceeded what Klaus had eaten even during the best days in North Africa. During the lunch break, Morrison sat with the prisoners and spoke about his farm with the casual pride of someone discussing ordinary success rather than exceptional achievement. His operation covered 2,000 acres, all of it owned outright rather than leased from collective authorities. He employed local workers during peak seasons, owned 4 tractors that he maintained himself, and sold his cotton to processors who paid market rates that allowed him to prosper year after year. The scale was staggering. A single American farmer controlling more land than entire German villages had farmed collectively, producing crops in quantities that exceeded regional outputs Klaus had known before the war. And Morrison spoke of neighboring farms with similar or larger operations, describing an agricultural economy that functioned through individual initiative rather than centralized planning. That evening, returning to camp with muscles aching from honest labor, Klaus received his first payment in camp scrip. The amount represented half a day's work, yet it exceeded what he could have earned in a full week as a German soldier. The mathematics was devastating. American farmers could afford to pay enemy prisoners more than Germany paid its own military forces. Over the following weeks, Klaus settled into routines that would have seemed impossible during his military service. Work during daylight hours brought him into contact with American civilians who showed no hatred despite the war their sons were fighting overseas. Evening meals continued to provide nutrition that exceeded German civilian rations. Nights offered rest without fear of bombardment or sudden orders to deploy. The camp library contained books in German, English, and other languages, a collection that suggested someone had invested significant resources in prisoner welfare beyond minimum requirements. Klaus began reading American novels, trying to understand the society that had created this incomprehensible abundance. The stories described communities where individual effort led to prosperity, where government existed to protect rights rather than direct all activity, where diversity created strength through competition of ideas rather than weakness through internal division. Werner discovered the camp's music program, where prisoners could form bands and perform for their fellow internees. Instruments were provided through some American charitable organization that apparently had resources to donate equipment to enemy prisoners while the nation fought a global war. Werner, who had played clarinet before being conscripted, joined a small ensemble that practiced in the evenings and performed on weekends. The music was the final crack in Klaus's ideological armor. Listening to Werner play melodies from before the war, surrounded by men who had been enemies but were now just prisoners trying to maintain humanity through art, he understood that everything he had fought for was not just defeated but had been built on foundations of systematic lies about human nature, social organization, and the sources of national strength. Hans Keller, the veteran prisoner who had witnessed others go through similar revelations, sat beside Klaus during one evening concert. "You're beginning to see it," he said quietly. "The truth they couldn't let us know because it would have destroyed support for the war before it began." Klaus didn't respond, afraid that words would release emotions he had been containing for weeks. Around him, prisoners listened to music that reminded them of homes that no longer existed, families who survived on rations that couldn't sustain life, a nation that had sacrificed everything for promises that couldn't be kept. The Texas summer slowly gave way to autumn, bringing relief from heat that had seemed unbearable but proved survivable with adequate water and shelter. The cotton harvest concluded, replaced by other agricultural work that kept prisoners employed and American farms productive despite the departure of young men to military service. Klaus volunteered for a detail at the Morrison farm, helping with equipment maintenance and general repairs. Samuel Morrison discovered that Klaus had mechanical training and began teaching him about American agricultural machinery, sharing knowledge with an openness that would have been impossible between German authorities and foreign workers. The International Harvester tractor that Morrison allowed Klaus to service represented engineering sophistication that challenged every assumption about American industrial capabilities. The engine ran smoothly due to precision manufacturing that minimized friction and maximized efficiency. The transmission shifted through gears that had been machined to tolerances German factories couldn't match with available equipment. The hydraulic systems operated reliably because American metallurgy produced steel that didn't fail under stress. Morrison explained maintenance procedures with patience that suggested he viewed teaching as valuable in itself rather than just ensuring his equipment functioned. He described how American manufacturers provided service manuals, replacement parts, and technical support that allowed individual farmers to maintain complex machinery without requiring centralized repair facilities. The support infrastructure was what truly staggered Klaus. Morrison could order parts from catalogs and receive them within days, shipped through distribution networks that functioned despite wartime transportation demands. American industry produced tractors, maintained supply chains, supported end users, and continued innovating all while manufacturing military equipment in quantities that had overwhelmed German resistance. One afternoon, Morrison's wife brought fresh lemonade to the field where Klaus worked on a tractor's cooling system. Sarah Morrison was a woman in her early 50s, dressed practically but showing none of the poverty that had become visible in German women by 1943. She handed Klaus a glass without hesitation, treating an enemy prisoner with casual courtesy that seemed incomprehensible given that American soldiers were dying in Europe fighting men like him. "My son is in France," she mentioned conversationally, her German halting but sincere. "Fighting your countrymen, I suppose." But that doesn't mean I can't treat you decent while you're here helping us bring in the harvest. The statement contained more devastating truth than any propaganda could deliver. These Americans could separate individual human dignity from national conflict, showing kindness to enemies while simultaneously fighting a war against their nation. They possessed moral sophistication that Nazi ideology had claimed was impossible in diverse democratic societies. Klaus found himself unable to respond, his throat tight with emotions that had been building for months. Sarah Morrison seemed to understand, patting his shoulder with maternal comfort before returning to her house, leaving him with lemonade that tasted like childhood summers before the world had gone mad. As autumn deepened, news from Europe began filtering through official channels and letters from prisoners whose families still had means to send mail. The reports painted pictures of devastation that confirmed what Klaus had begun to suspect. Germany was collapsing under weight of industrial powers it couldn't match, fighting enemies whose productive capacity exceeded Axis capabilities by margins that made continued resistance meaningless. Yet here in Texas, far from combat zones, life continued with normalcy that seemed obscene compared to what Germans endured. American civilians ate well, maintained their farms, sent sons to war while daughters attended universities, all without the total mobilization that had consumed German society. The United States was fighting a global war almost as a secondary activity, deploying only a fraction of its potential while maintaining civilian prosperity that exceeded German peacetime standards. The contradiction was unbearable. Klaus had fought for a nation that promised strength through sacrifice, unity through racial purity, victory through superior will. Instead he had discovered that prosperity came from freedom, strength emerged from diversity, and victory belonged to societies that treated even enemies with dignity that Nazi Germany had never shown its own citizens. Winter arrived in Texas, mild by German standards but bringing change to rhythms Klaus had learned during months of captivity. The work details shifted from field labor to maintenance tasks, repairing equipment and preparing farms for spring planting. Klaus continued working for the Morrison family, who had come to trust him with increasingly complex mechanical tasks. Christmas 1943 arrived with festivities that shattered whatever remained of Klaus's understanding of captivity. The camp authorities permitted prisoners to organize celebrations that included decorations shipped from charitable organizations across America, care packages containing cookies and candies sent by churches who somehow had resources to show kindness to enemy soldiers, and a special meal that exceeded anything Klaus had consumed even during peacetime holidays in Germany. The turkey was massive, roasted to perfection and served with stuffing made from real bread, cranberry sauce that contained actual berries and sugar, potatoes mashed with cream and butter, vegetables that showed no signs of preservation damage, and pies made with fruit and sweeteners that German civilians would have considered fantasy. Samuel Morrison had invited Klaus to spend Christmas afternoon at his farmhouse, an invitation that seemed to violate every reasonable boundary between captor and prisoner. Yet there Klaus sat in a warm living room decorated with a tree that reached the ceiling, surrounded by Morrison family members who treated him not as a defeated enemy but as a guest who happened to be far from home during the holidays. Sarah Morrison served coffee and pie while her daughter Margaret asked questions about Germany with genuine curiosity rather than hostility. She was studying geography at a nearby college, one of thousands of American women receiving university education while their nation fought a global war. The casualness of her opportunity demolished Nazi theories about resource allocation and social priorities. Margaret described her coursework, her ambitions to teach, her plans to travel after the war ended. She spoke of these dreams with confidence that her society would survive and prosper, that individual aspirations mattered more than collective sacrifice, that education served personal development rather than just national industrial needs. The Morrison's son Thomas was in France fighting Wehrmacht forces, yet his parents showed no resentment toward Klaus, who had worn the same uniform. They understood something that Nazi ideology had refused to acknowledge. Individual humans could be separated from national conflicts, personal dignity could coexist with military opposition, kindness toward enemies didn't weaken resolve against their nation's aggression. This moral complexity, this ability to hold contradictory truths simultaneously, represented sophistication that totalitarian thinking had claimed was impossible in democratic societies. As winter progressed towards spring, Klaus witnessed the full cycle of American agricultural abundance. The Morrison farm prepared for planting with equipment maintenance that revealed the depth of industrial support available to individual farmers. Replacement parts arrived promptly from manufacturers, technical manuals provided detailed guidance for repairs, regional distributors maintained inventory that allowed farmers to operate independently rather than depending on centralized authorities for basic supplies. The spring planting demonstrated mechanized efficiency that made German collective farming seem primitive by comparison. Tractors pulled seeders that planted multiple rows simultaneously with precision spacing, operating at speeds that would have required dozens of workers using traditional methods. Fertilizers arrived in quantities that exceeded what entire German districts could obtain, manufactured by chemical companies that somehow maintained civilian production while also producing military explosives. Klaus had studied engineering before conscription, and the mathematics of American productivity staggered his comprehension. The Morrison farm alone consumed more fuel, fertilizer, and manufactured goods annually than medium-sized German towns had accessed during peacetime. Yet this was ordinary prosperity rather than exceptional wealth, repeated across thousands of farms throughout Texas and millions more across the continental United States. Werner continued performing in the camp orchestra, which had grown to include more than 20 musicians playing arrangements of German, American, and international compositions. The music program received support from American charitable organizations who donated instruments, sheet music, and even funding for professional instruction from local teachers who volunteered their time. The generosity seemed incomprehensible. A nation at war deploying resources to ensure enemy prisoners could maintain cultural activities that served no strategic purpose beyond acknowledging their humanity. During one evening concert, Hans Keller sat beside Klaus and spoke quietly about the psychological transformation he had witnessed in hundreds of prisoners. They arrived believing Nazi propaganda about American weakness, he explained, his voice barely audible above the music. Then they experience abundance that contradicts everything they were taught. Most eventually accept the truth. Some never do because accepting it means acknowledging they fought for lies that cost millions of lives. Klaus understood he was past the point of denial. Every meal, every interaction with American civilians, every piece of functioning equipment confirmed that Germany had been defeated not by military force alone but by industrial capacity built on foundations of freedom that totalitarian control could never match. Democratic societies weren't weak, they were strong precisely because they allowed individual initiative rather than crushing it beneath centralized authority. The summer of 1944 brought news of Allied advances that confirmed Germany's approaching collapse. Klaus received letters from his mother in Stuttgart describing conditions that contrasted devastatingly with his experience in Texas. She wrote of constant hunger, bombed buildings that couldn't be repaired due to material shortages, deaths from diseases that proper nutrition would have prevented, and pervasive fear that consumed whatever hope remained. Her careful phrasing avoided direct criticism of the regime, but desperation showed through words chosen to pass censors who monitored all correspondence. Klaus realized with crushing guilt that he was living better as a prisoner in Texas than his family lived as citizens in Germany. He ate 3 substantial meals daily while his mother queued for rations insufficient to sustain life. He worked for wages that allowed him to purchase luxuries while his father labored in a munitions factory for compensation that couldn't buy necessities. He slept in comfortable barracks while his sister huddled in a basement shelter during nightly bombing raids. The contradiction destroyed whatever patriotic sentiment had survived his capture. Germany had demanded total sacrifice for promises of glory, yet delivered only suffering while treating its people worse than America treated its enemies. The revelation was physically painful, burning in his chest like a wound that wouldn't heal. As autumn arrived again, marking more than a year since Klaus's arrival at Camp Herne, rumors began circulating about potential repatriation. The war was clearly ending, Germany's defeat inevitable, and prisoners would eventually be returned to help rebuild the shattered nation. The prospect filled Klaus with dread rather than anticipation. He had grown accustomed to abundance, safety, and treatment that acknowledged his humanity. Returning to Germany meant facing starvation, devastation, and the psychological weight of knowing everything he had believed was built on lies. Samuel Morrison noticed Klaus's growing anxiety during their daily work. One afternoon, while repairing a tractor's hydraulic system, the farmer spoke carefully about the future. "You're worried about going back," he observed, his German improving after months of regular conversation. "Can't say I blame you. Sounds like Germany's in rough shape from what we hear." Klaus nodded, unable to articulate the depth of his conflicted feelings. Morrison continued, seeming to understand what Klaus couldn't express. "War ends eventually," he said quietly. "When it does, somebody's got to rebuild. Your people will need men who learn different ways of doing things, who saw that societies can prosper through cooperation rather than conquest. Maybe your time here wasn't just captivity. Maybe it was education for what comes after." The words resonated with possibility Klaus hadn't considered. Perhaps witnessing American prosperity served a purpose beyond his personal experience. Perhaps understanding how democratic societies created abundance through freedom rather than force would matter when Germany faced the task of rebuilding from ruins of totalitarian ideology. Winter came again, bringing with it news of Germany's final collapse. Hitler's death, Berlin's fall, unconditional surrender that ended the European War in May 1945. Klaus received the information with relief rather than grief, grateful that the dying had finally stopped even as he mourned the millions who had perished for beliefs built on systematic deception. The camp population began preparing for eventual repatriation, though logistical challenges meant the process would take months or even years to complete. Klaus found himself hoping for delays, desperate to extend his time in Texas where life made sense and the future seemed possible. The thought of returning to Germany filled him with an anxiety that bordered on panic. One evening, Werner confronted Klaus about his obvious distress. "You don't want to go back," he stated flatly, understanding written across his face. "Neither do I. Neither do most of us who've been here long enough to understand what we left behind and what we found here." The admission hung between them like confession of betrayal, yet it was simple truth that hundreds of prisoners shared but few spoke aloud. They had come as soldiers fighting for a Reich that promised glory through conquest. They were leaving as men who had discovered that prosperity came from freedom, strength emerged from diversity, and dignity belonged to all humans rather than just those deemed superior by arbitrary racial theories. The months stretched toward 1946, with repatriation processing moving slowly through bureaucratic channels overwhelmed by millions of displaced persons across Europe. Klaus continued working for the Morrison family, who had offered to sponsor his immigration to America if such arrangements became possible after his official prisoner status ended. The offer represented generosity so extraordinary it seemed almost incomprehensible, yet Samuel Morrison made it with the same casual sincerity he brought to all his interactions. "You're a good worker and a decent man," Morrison explained when Klaus struggled to respond to the immigration offer. "War made you an enemy, but peace can make you a neighbor if you want it. Texas has room for people willing to work hard and treat others fair." The possibility of staying in America, of building a life in a society that had shown him more kindness as a prisoner than Germany had shown him as a citizen, consumed Klaus's thoughts during the final months before repatriation orders arrived. When the official notice finally came in March 1946, informing him that transport to Germany would occur within 60 days, Klaus felt his carefully maintained composure finally crack. He found Werner that evening, and together they walked the camp perimeter in silence, processing the reality that their time in Texas was ending. Eventually Werner spoke, his voice rough with suppressed emotion. 3 years ago I believed Germany represented civilization's highest achievement," he said quietly. "Now I know we were prisoners of lies long before we became prisoners of war. The real captivity was ideological. This place set us free by showing us truth we had been conditioned to reject." Klaus understood exactly what Werner meant. They had arrived in Texas as devoted soldiers of the Reich, convinced of German superiority and American weakness. They were leaving as men who had witnessed the devastating reality that prosperity flowed from freedom, that strength emerged from diversity, that generosity demonstrated confidence rather than weakness. The knowledge would haunt them forever, making it impossible to return to the comfortable certainties that had once defined their understanding of the world. The final weeks passed with painful speed, each day bringing Klaus closer to departure he dreaded. The Morrison family hosted a farewell dinner where Sarah served the same abundant meal she had provided countless times during his work details, but this time Klaus could barely eat, his throat tight with emotions he had been suppressing for months. Samuel shook his hand and reminded him that the immigration sponsorship remained available whenever the bureaucratic processes allowed it to be pursued. Margaret gave him books to take back to Germany, American literature she hoped would remind him that different futures were possible than the one Nazi ideology had promised. The transport truck arrived on a morning that felt like every other Texas day, sun already beating down at 7 a.m., heat building toward the oppressive levels Klaus had learned to endure. He climbed aboard with Werner and dozens of other prisoners, all of them carrying the psychological weight of men who had discovered their beliefs were built on foundations that couldn't support scrutiny. As the truck rolled away from Camp Hearn, Klaus pressed his face against the slats and watched the landscape recede, fields of cotton and corn representing abundance that Germany couldn't match even before the war had consumed everything. The Morrison farm disappeared in the distance, and with it went the hope that Klaus might never have to face the ruins of the nation he had once served. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.